Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I hope that you're taking good care of yourself, staying safe, staying healthy in this bizarre time. Like so many of us, I've been looking around at a world that it's hard to recognize and saying things I never thought I would hear myself say, like I'm sheltering in place and quarantining. These are very extreme and dramatic times. So I hope that you're taking good care of yourself and that you're using this period of retreat to practice creatively, spiritually, psychologically, and deepen and question the way that you live your life so that when this passes, we can all move into this new period with some renewed insight and ideas for taking what we've learned during this time and integrating it into our so-called ordinary lives. So today we're going to be talking about living without a net. And I don't usually focus on one school of philosophy in my Seekers Forum talks, but these aren't ordinary times. And there's nobody better than the Stoics to give us principles for how to move through adversity consciously and with a sense of our own strength and character. We're going to be looking at how is it possible to thrive in adversity, which sounds counterintuitive, but isn't, and to use moments of pain and loss, fear, uncertainty to deepen our practice and improve our lives as human beings. So before we go further, let's just talk a little bit about who the Stoics were and what they believed. The Stoics were a school of philosophy that began in Greece in the 3rd century BC, which focused on how individuals can keep their balance and sanity in the toughest of times. This is a school of thought that has continued to enrich people down through the ages. According to Stoic teachings, the path to happiness, what they called eudaimonia, is found in accepting the moment exactly as it presents itself, by not allowing yourself to be controlled either by the desire for pleasure or the fear of pain, by using your mind to understand the world and to doing your part in nature's plan, which they believed was treating each other fairly, justly, learning to work together, bringing out the best in one another. In the ancient world, the 3 best known proponents of Stoicism were Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a slave, born a slave, and then crippled by his master. Seneca was someone who had to deal with Caligula and Nero, who eventually ordered his death. And Marcus Aurelius was the emperor who guided Rome through its own pandemic, known as the Antonine Plague, which lasted 15 years and actually wiped out a third of the population. So these were all men who knew what it meant to suffer. They knew how important it was to have practical, down-to-earth, applicable practices for waking ourselves up and keeping our balance in the slings and arrows of our own fate. Stoicism doesn't concern itself with complicated theories about the world. There's very little metaphysics in Stoicism. Instead, it looks at helping us overcome destructive emotions and act on what can be acted upon. It's built for action, not endless debate. So today we're going to be talking about a handful of spiritual exercises that the Stoics created that can help us in our current crisis. These are exercises that have endured for 2,000 years and can really give us strength and perspective as well as resilience that we didn't know we had if we apply ourselves to them. So let's start with the first exercise. The first exercise is to practice misfortune. Seneca believed that even in the good times, our spirit should be preparing itself for hard times. Now, that can seem like a dreary way to live, but in fact, the opposite is true. When we practice misfortune, we inoculate ourselves against fear and we ease the shock of change when it happens. So, to prepare ourselves for loss, Seneca believed, we should set aside time in our lives to practice extreme simplicity, which is known in some spiritual traditions as practicing poverty. Of course, many of us are doing this already, paring our lives down to their bare essentials, being cut off from one another by a government mandate. Seneca advises us to put ourselves face to face with want and then ask ourselves, is this what I used to dread? Is this what I used to dread? When we practice doing without, when we practice what they call misfortune, we're not so surprised when things are eventually taken away, as they all will be sooner or later. Seneca goes a step further than that, though, and recommends that we imagine worst-case scenarios, not as a way to spook ourselves, but as a way to challenge our fears and also get a reality check against where we actually are. When we practice misfortune, we're able to be in the present moment with all of its complexities while maintaining our gratitude, the gratitude for what we do have. So nothing could be more important than to acknowledge what remains with us and the strength that we have, the relative benefits that we have in our lives, without deceiving ourselves or going into denial about what hurts and what's difficult, but also without losing a sense of what could be much, much worse. This is really important. The next spiritual exercise is to train our perceptions to avoid good and bad. Marcus Aurelius put it this way. He said, quote, "Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed and you haven't been. Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed and you haven't been." Now, that's not denial, it's not dissociation. It's actually claiming the power of choice that resides in us at every moment. The Stoics believed that attitude is everything. When we see ourselves as victims, we become victims. When we see ourselves as free, then we're free. They describe this as turning the obstacle upside down. So when we can do that, when we can turn the obstacle upside down, whatever it might be, then every so-called bad can become a new source of good. Every event offers an opportunity to develop character. For example, let's say you're trying to help somebody and they respond with some rude remark or aggression. Instead of making your life more difficult, the exercise says, they're actually directing you toward new virtues. For example, patience or understanding. When you can't go outside, you go more deeply into where you are. If you can't hug your friends, you imagine new ways of connecting. If you discover that you are ill, you have the chance to look into the part of yourself that doesn't die, the spiritual, the deathless. As Marcus Aurelius puts it, quote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. This is a profound spiritual truth. Opposition and opportunity are everywhere. These are what Barack Obama used to call teachable moments. Well, today we find ourselves in the first global teachable moment of our lifetime, which gives us the opportunity to ask, what are we choosing to learn from this unprecedented time? How entrepreneurial are we being in our spiritual life and our imaginative life? Remember, entrepreneurs, by definition, are people who take advantage of and create opportunities. Or to the Stoics, everything is an opportunity to wake up, to consider what's happening with a clear mind, and to find fuel for freedom in hard situations. To the practicing Stoic, there is no good or bad. There's only perception and the awareness that we control our own perceptions. The third spiritual exercise is to remember that everything is ephemeral. From the highest achievements to the lowliest suffering, all things cease to exist. When we think on this deeply, it actually frees us from the fear of loss. Of course, the practice of looking at impermanence as the doorway to freedom is common to most spiritual traditions. The paradoxical fact that life's brevity actually intensifies its sweetness. As one anonymous medieval monk put it, if the cardinal's flight from bank to bank were less brief, it would also be less glorious. Now, the ego shrinks away from this truth, and yet it remains undeniably true that when we see things for what they are, fleeting, including this situation we find ourselves in now, it comes as an enormous relief. Imagine if things didn't change, what a moldy, dead place the earth would become. When we remember to reflect on the fact that everything is ephemeral, life can become much less traumatic. The Stoics make a distinction between being afraid and being actually harmed. Often when we're afraid, it registers as harm, but is far more a projection into the future, into what might be. What if this virus never goes away? What if life as we know it has ended and it's all downhill from here? When we remind ourselves that everything passes, including our worst case scenarios, it releases the dread that can come with upheaval and reduce the surprise element of loss and fear and uncertainty. The next exercise is to take the view from above. Take the view from above. This is also known as Plato's view. This exercise invites us to take a step back, to zoom out and see life from a higher vantage point than our own. This practice of envisioning all the millions and millions of people, what Marcus Aurelius called all the armies, farms, weddings and divorces, births and deaths. It prompts us to take a larger perspective and reminds us also of how small we are. The view from above changes our value judgments on life and also allows us to see most everyday concerns for what they are, absurd. Even in difficult times like these, the gap between our self-centered point of view and the truth of our situation is wider than we may realize. Ask yourself, in what ways are you exaggerating the truth of your present situation? How bad are things for you today, really? When you take the view from above, it deflates the ego and it inflates, it expands awareness. It helps you take your proper place in the human drama, which is humbling, which is grounding, and also refreshing. We step away from the trick mirror in the mind that blows everything out of proportion. And it also helps us to tap into what the Stoics called sympathia, or mutual interdependence with the whole of humanity. The next exercise is memento mori, which is the ancient practice of reflecting on mortality. This goes all the way back to Socrates. Remember, Socrates said that the proper practice of philosophy is about nothing else but dying and being dead. Now, that can seem kind of unappealing, but if philosophy is the love of truth, we have to start with impermanence. We have to start with mortality. And we talk a lot in the Seeker's Forum about using death as an awakener that sweetens our lives, that puts our values in order, that encourages us to be grateful. This contemplation on mortality, this memento mori, also compels us not to waste a moment of our precious lives not being present, or blaming ourselves, or judging ourselves for falling short, comparing ourselves negatively to other people, or spending inordinate amounts of time worrying about things that are outside our control. This pandemic has brought the process of death and dying closer to us as a species in a more universal way than ever before. For the first time in human history, we are focused as a species on mortality in real time together. Can you imagine what could happen if we used this opportunity wisely as a way to bring down the walls of tribalism, as a way to equalize our own fears, as a way to lighten up? And of course, it has to always begin with ourselves. So another piece of the Stoic philosophy is not looking outward for answers, not looking outward for confirmation, not looking outward for change, but rather beginning with ourselves. And that leads us to the next practice, which is to ask, is this within my control? Is this within my control? The benefits of reflecting on our personal limits are many. Epictetus, the former slave, explained, quote, "The chief task in life is to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control." He goes on to say, "Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own." This Stoic practice of differentiating between what we can change and what we can't is uniquely liberating. We're homebound for a month? Well, then what are the things that you can control? Think of all the things that you've said you want to do at home, but never have the time to do. And choose to make this a watershed period. You've always wanted to read War and Peace, or learn how to bake bread, or plant a garden, or turn that spare room into a meditation space. All of these things are up to us. Rather than waste energy complaining about all the things we can't do, it's far wiser to look at the masses of things that we can. The time that we spend sort of hurling ourselves against immovable objects is time not spent on leaning into what is possible. So try returning to this question on a regular basis. If you can focus on making clear what parts of your day are within your control and what parts aren't, you'll not only be happier, but you'll also have a distinct advantage over other people who don't realize that they're fighting an unwinnable battle. A great way of doing this, of differentiating between what we can change and what we can't, is to write down our thoughts and feelings. It helps us to separate the true from the false, ideally on a daily basis. Which brings us to the next spiritual exercise for the Stoics, which was to keep a journal. The Stoics were great proponents of journaling as a path of wisdom. Epictetus would tell his students that philosophy was something that they should write down day by day, and that this writing was how they should exercise themselves. It's been documented that people in quarantine in Wuhan, in China, journaled as a way of coping. In Stoicism, the art of journaling is more than just keeping a factual diary. It goes deeper than that. The daily practice of journaling is the philosophy. Preparing for the day ahead, reflecting on the day that has passed, reminding yourself of the wisdom that you've taken on from teachers, from your reading, from your own experiences. The Stoics believe that it's not enough to simply hear these lessons once or to experience things once, but instead to practice them over and over again, to turn them over in their mind. And most importantly, write them down so that they can see what's within themselves coming objectively out on the paper. As somebody who has kept a journal myself for over 50 years, I can attest to the incredible power of this practice. In fact, it's the centerpiece of what I teach, Writing to Awaken, that helps people free themselves through transformative writing. So try to take 30 minutes a day, if possible, particularly during this time, to note down your thoughts and feelings. Inner life is much more important than the outer events, except as they impact your happiness. When you sit down to write and don't feel the urge to explore this or that, then you can use the questions in these spiritual exercises. Where are you trying to control what's beyond you? How are you giving your power away by allowing other people's opinions to wound you? And so on. And finally, we come to the most difficult of these spiritual exercises, which is to practice loving everything that happens. Practice loving everything that happens. That sounds like a very tall order. The great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche calls this amor fati, the love of fate. The Stoics embraced amor fati as central to happiness and freedom. Marcus Aurelius, who, if you haven't read his Meditations, it's one of the great philosophical works of all time. But he put it this way. He said, quote, "A blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything that is thrown into it." Isn't that correct? A blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything that's thrown into it. In other words, no matter what happens to us, it can be used for illumination. Epictetus echoed very much the same sentiment. He said, don't seek for things to happen the way you want them to. Rather, wish that what happens happen the way it happens. Then you will be happy. So ask yourself, how can you practice amor fati today? What are the most difficult things for you to love about your present situation? Not the global situation, but your actual life as it is today. When you open your heart to make space for the hard stuff, you realize how big you actually are and how much more power you have at your disposal. Power to bear what seems unbearable. Power to thrive in spite of adversity. And the power to love even the most painful parts of your life, knowing that by doing so, you are growing enormously as a human being. So let's take 5 minutes to do a writing practice together now. Please take out something to write with and ask yourself, how can you practice amor fati during this time of crisis? What do you need the most practice accepting? Can you see how it might strengthen you to love this thing that you reject? These are all parts of the same question. We'll take 5 minutes to do that, please, and then we'll come back together.